This is Agriculture Today, and I'm Shelby Varner with the K-State Radio Network. Dan O'Brien, K-State grain economist, begins today's show with a grain market update. He reviews what he expects from soon-to-be released USDA reports. K-State row crop plant pathology specialist Rodrigo Onofre continues the show with information about diseases that crop producers could be seeing in their fields. We are also joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack as he discusses combating food insecurity. Concluding today's show is K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond with this week's weather outlook. He says during next week we can expect a change in the weather pattern. That and more is coming up ahead on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we start our Friday show with a grain market update. And as always, we're joined with K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. Dan, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Shelby.
Dan, kicking off the grain market conversation with what are futures looking like?
If we're looking at wheat, not very good. We've been trending down and have seemed to be unable to see much positive in any news that comes along. Of course, this is happening right during seeding time, so we might have the opportunity to speak about that later. We did see on the corn futures, and so corn futures yesterday, they were up about 4 to 5 cents, with Dees corn closing at 488.5. And it's interesting to compare that to next year's Dees corn number at 507. So somewhere in there, that the market is probably thinking that between the United States, Brazil, Argentina, that the high soybean price is probably going to attract enough acres that will have a positive effect on the corn market. For soybean prices, again, basically going sideways, still a price that's, given all that's been going on, still pretty healthy. November soybeans closed at $13.50. Yesterday, down 2 cents, which is just kind of the noise of the market on a daily basis. Compared to the coming year, you're looking at $12.69 for November 24 beans. So again, just the opposite situation of corn and of the corn current harvest and next year's harvest contract. So I think that you got an indication of the psychology of the market in terms of where they think things will be going over the next 12 months. And as we talked about for wheat, 685 was the close. That was down 9 cents, and we've been on a pretty much a moderate downward trend for a while in the wheat markets.
And what about cash markets?
Cash markets still, we have basis bids off of those futures prices. We're about ready to come into October. We're not rolling into any new contracts yet. That won't happen. Well, for corn until we get to Dees 1 or thereabouts. For soybeans, November 1, or for wheat. So that source of volatility is out of the way. But it's interesting to look at, to me anyway, where we still see basis strength at. So strongest cash corn bid. There's one bid that stands out by several cents in the Garden City region at 5.19 with positive 31 cent basis. Next best is Hutchinson at 10 over at 4.98. Hutchinson area, Colby area, even money at 4.88, and others 4.68, 4.83, something like that. New crop bids, again, you do have that the strength of that Garden City area with a 5.14 new crop bid, 26 over. All the other bids are either even money. Well, basically they're pretty close to even money in Hutchinson, Salina, Colby. More weakness showing in the eastern part of the state in Topeka and Columbus. And as you and I have been talking about for a while now, the grain sorghum bids have been coming off pretty strong. Salina has a new crop corn bid of 483, new crop grain sorghum bid of 518. So that's showing strength of exports likely on the sorghum side. And Hutchinson stands out even more. Again, right in the central part of the state, right where we're shipping. If we're going to accumulate grain sorghum and ship it out, it's mostly going to happen there. A bid of 50 over for harvest in the Hutchinson area was the top bid. Not all elevators are there, but one or two. So when you have that, they've got an order. They're trying to fill some trains, 1 or 2 trains or something like that. And so you have right now the leading bid in the feed grain sector in Kansas for what we're watching is in that Hutchinson area at 50 over. And that really stands out across the state. Soybean bids really around a low of 1225 out in the west, a high of 1301 in the Hutchinson area. Again, Topeka not far behind. And for wheat, as we talked about, again, just lots of variability. We have seen in the western third of the state that basis bids for wheat really start to decline. It's just more information that farmers are going to take into account when they pull their drills out into fields and plant wheat or not. So I think where we have had moisture, no doubt they're planting off into a situation that likely give them a stand and they'll go forward. And so I guess as we really see the major thrust of wheat seeding happen once we get into October, and it seems that we're well underway for that, and we'll see where all that goes this year.
And Dan, kind of taking even a deeper dive into that wheat market, while it might not be the focus, a lot of things are happening worldwide.
Yes, at least by my take, Shelby, it seems that we have a whole bunch of things that would normally be viewed as very optimistic for wheat prices, particularly the world wheat ending stocks to use at a 16-year low for wheat, showing, and that's a world less China perspective, and China doesn't export almost any wheat at all. They're an importer, and there are questions about how much there actually is there in China, but still 16-year low for that. And since 2017, we've been actually declining in terms of the quantity of stocks. Normally, we'd be in a situation where we think, well, gosh, supply-demand fundamentals would be supporting pretty strong wheat prices. But here in the U.S., with our strong dollar, with wheat flowing out of Ukraine, of Russia, and again, wheat from Europe competing with us here in the States coming into the country, we used to have a lot of pessimism right now in terms of the market. So I told an audience in our ag lenders meetings that we had this last week that it's pretty difficult to sit across the desk and come to a working arrangement with your borrowers and have basically to see prices falling off as they are, yet to have this information in your hand that, gracious, in the long run, we're on the verge of some real volatility, very likely, that really drive prices higher, but we just haven't seen it of late. Luckily, when we do put wheat in, we're not borrowing lots of money, near as much as we are for other crops, so it's easier to get that crop in, get it up, and then see where you stand in the spring, and that's probably what a good number of people will do.
And Dan, the USDA is once again putting out some reports here soon. And what will those reports be?
Here at 11 o'clock today, after our program is done with KSU, the USDA will be releasing its September grain stocks and small grains reports. And also kind of tied in with this, it's very likely with those stocks reports, they'll be able to do a backcast on what the actual size was of crops last year. So for corn and soybean people, there'll be a lot of interest in that. Again, if it turns out that the USDA perhaps has overestimated the size of those crops from last year, well, then that comes back into the next set of supply-demand balance sheets that we hope come out in October. Given the government shutdown, that may be in question. But whenever the USDA does release its next set of reports, if it comes out that the size of that crop was overestimated, then by some degree, well, then you're taking down beginning stocks, you're tightening up projected stocks on down the road. So that's one thing that we'll be watching. And expectations are that the USDA did overestimate the size of the crops in 2022 a little bit for corn and beans. And stocks numbers, generally not lots of changes thought to be on the docket for that, but I guess for me, I'm watching the quarterly stocks numbers the closest at this time because it just has such a strong effect on all the balance sheets and all. And if the stocks numbers are way off base, then the USDA has to go back in and fiddle on the usage or the supplies to go try to rectify all this stuff, to try to reconcile it. And that's when eventually things can come about. I should mention something. We touched on the potential for a government shutdown. And we've been talking, we at K-State and others have been talking with USDA of late on programs coming up. And, a delay of 2 or 3 or 4 days, not much. But one thing that is happening, if they do get a government shutdown, then you're really affecting NASS, the National Ag Stats Service, who sends people out into the fields right around the 1st, which is when the shutdown would be happening, to get enumerated field level surveys. Well, if they can't get that, then you're going to hurt the veracity, the accuracy of that October crop report. and you just have an accordion effect. And if something like that drags on for 1 or 2 or 3 weeks, very possible we may just not have an October set of USDA reports, either the crop production or the WASDE reports. That's not the end of the world. The market would still be out there functioning, but we just wouldn't have the hard data from USDA to work with. So we'll see if that happens. Hope it doesn't for the sake of the ag markets. But if it does, we'll go on and we'll just pay attention to everything except the government numbers, because they probably won't be there.
And Dan, so what would you tell our crop producers to kind of keep an eye on as they look forward?
Well, when we do get hard numbers, I think the biggest issues will be what the U.S. yields are for corn and for soybeans, front and center. I think that it's very likely that the corn number could either be unchanged or lower. I'd be really surprised if it's higher. I think there's a lot of risk, sizable risk, that the soybean yield and production number could be tangibly, significantly lowered. And in that balance sheet, there's not a lot of room for that to happen. We're already, just about any move lower, we're going to start rationing usage pretty hard. And we just don't have a lot of room to do that. So a lot of potential for soybeans to respond higher out of that. And corn, we have such large acres that there'd be a response if we reduce corn supplies, but we really don't get below 2 billion bushels until we get to about 170, 171 bushels an acre, and we're at 173.5 now. So anyway, that's kind of my view of where things could end up going. Really more, I wouldn't say worried, but more focused on what soybeans could do. And the last thing that could come about, we do see fuel prices moving to the higher side. And one surprise that could come in on the corn market is if we get a real supply shock on oil and gasoline's not available, the government could come in and mandate from E10 to E15 or something like that. So that would affect the ethanol industry and just draw that much more corn in. If that happens, well, it's very likely to have a positive impact on corn prices.
That was K-State grain economist Dan O'Brien. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more ahead. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we continue our show now discussing some diseases that producers could have seen or could be seeing in their crops. And then to talk about it, we're joined by K-State row crop plant pathology specialist Rodrigo Onofre. Rodrigo, thanks for joining us today.
Well, it's always a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the invitation.
Through these different crops and through some of the different diseases that could be seen, first talking about stalk rot in grain sorghum.
Yeah, so I guess we're at the point where right now we're approaching harvesting in grain sorghum in several locations too, and corn as well. So it's just something to keep in mind that those stalk rots will start to showing up, right? And we're talking about mainly here on the charcoal rot and fusarium stalk rots. Both are really hard to management in terms of chemicals, let's say fungicides. There's not many options out there, right? So we're always looking to variety selection, hybrid selection, rotation, and stay green characteristics.
And how can they identify this charcoal rot and fusarium stalk rot in their fields?
Well, the first thing, it's a big problem because if it lodges, it will be really hard to get that grain out of the ground, right? So properly identifying and find if you have will be important just to time that harvest well. And to do that, you can do a push test where you just go into your field and push a plant towards your chest or forward about, say, 45 degrees. And if it snaps, likely you're going to have a stalk rot problem, right? You can also split those stalks, and that applies for corn or grain sorghum, right? You can split those stalks and see if there's any discoloration, either pink or some black structures inside those stalks to see if you have or not stalk rots. And if you do, depending of the severity, well, I would say the incidence in your field, the amount of plants that you're seeing with stalk rots, I would suggest that trying to harvest those fields with higher moisture content, because likely if we have a storm or a windstorm pass through it, a lot of it could fall and could lodge, right?
And what is the cause of this?
So as I mentioned, there are two diseases, right? The charcoal rot and the fusarium stalk rots. They're two fungi. So those would be the two main ones that we find here in Kansas.
Stalk rot is one reason that people could be seeing corn lodging, especially if it's still in their fields or they've been working on getting it out. But what are some other causes for stalk lodging in corn?
So what we're seeing this year, and it's new to us, right? It's that tar spot disease that we had problems in the eastern part of Kansas during the season. And now what happened is that all our disease kind of like is taking advantage of that infection because it really shuts down the plant pretty quickly. So it kind of like opens doors for other disease to jump in, right? And then the same thing that we're just talking about it here, charcoal rot and fusarium can jump in and take advantage of that wicked plant, if you will.
And tar spot really not something producers want to see in their field, and one of the reasons for that is it can reduce their yield by quite a bit.
That's right. Yes, there was like Donovan and Atchison right now. The reports that I've been hearing is that we are having yield impact of up to or more than 30 bushels per acre, depending on the field. Of course, not all the fields were that bad, but there are definitely some fields that we're seeing that. And those fields where we had a lot of tar spot, where we definitely saw lodging, and a lot of folks on that part of the state already harvest their corn, which is great. But folks that still haven't harvested, just keep in mind that those stalks that have had several or severe tar spot are likely to have stalk rots and lodging issues too.
So if you have it, try to get out of the field as soon as possible.
That's right. Even with a little bit more moisture content would be better than seeing it lodge, right?
And for producers who have tar spot in their field this year, is that something they need to keep in mind as they make management decisions for next year? That's
right. So likely fields that have had tar spot this year will have next year, and neighboring fields as well, right? Right now, we're doubling our number of counties that tar spot has been reported since last year. So we went from 6 counties in the very far east part of the state to 12 counties now. So this disease keeps moving west, right? And the further west we're getting now, we're getting close to a lot of our irrigated ground, right? And we know that under irrigation, tar spot can be it can be the perfect storm for tar spot.
So is it the perfect storm because of that irrigation and that constant moisture?
Correct. So that extra water irrigation, tar spot really enjoys that.
Going back to the topic of stalk lodging in corn, another cause is corn rootworm or corn borers.
Right. So when we see anything that causes damage to the roots are opening wounds to pathogens to kind of like jump in, right? So good insect management or even like weed management can also help to reduce that severity or incidence across the field, right? So definitely those insects that you mentioned would help to increase the likelihood to have stalk rots problem.
And we've talked now about grain, sorghum, and corn, but are there any diseases that producers need to be looking for in their soybean fields?
So soybeans, I would say in the northeast part of the state, we saw a lot of SDS this year. Donovan, Atchison, Nemaha, Jackson, Jefferson. We did see quite a bit of SDS. We're seeing stem canker and phytophthora too. It's kind of like as an overview of the season of things that we saw it, right? And, of course, the dryland soybeans, a lot of it is having a hard time just to make it, depending where you are in the state. But because of the hot and dry weather condition, charcoal rot, it's kind of like the perfect storm for charcoal rot, right? So we think about corn, sorghum, and now soybean too. That same charcoal rot can be a problem, right? So likely you see some yield impact from that disease as well.
And is it the same fungi then that's impacting all 3 of these different crops with charcoal rot?
That's correct. So charcoal rot, it's a very hard pathogen to manage just because of its broad host range. So when we think about rotation, wheat would be the best option for charcoal rot just because it's one of the few hosts that charcoal rot would not infect.
And so, Rodrigo, how would you describe this year's disease management or diseases across the state for crops?
I would say for corn, we're having this new round of disease, right, with tar spot here. It's being alarming. I don't think it really overall, looking at our yield in Kansas, will be maybe like 1 or less than 1% impact on it. But I think it's definitely a concern in corn going forward. Definitely stalk rots now going forward too, with harvest approaching, with the drought and hot temperatures that we saw during the July period. I think we'll start seeing a lot of it now. Soybeans, SDS, and phytophthora stem canker being the main disease that we saw this year. And grain sorghum be the stalk rots as well as like corn.
Rodrigo, I appreciate you taking the time to join us today and give us an update on different diseases in corn, grain sorghum, and soybeans.
Yeah, of course. Anytime. Thank you.
That was K-State row crop plant pathology specialist Rodrigo Onofre. I will post links to the Agronomy update articles that he's completed on these topics in today's show notes, which you can find on agtoday.net. Before we cut to a break, we're now going to be joined by USDA's Rod Bain and Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack as he discusses ways that the world and the U.S. could combat food insecurity.
Efforts continue in combating global food insecurity. And Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack had opportunity during a recent World Food Day event to discuss where the focus should be to improve food security. He starts with American ag producers and their role in feeding the world.
Farmers take a great deal of pride in knowing that they're not only feeding themselves and their friends and neighbors in this country, but also the world. And we need and have a responsibility, given the incredible productivity of our land in the United States, we have a responsibility to respond to the growing climate crisis and the link that it has, making it more difficult for developing countries to produce what they need to produce for their own people.
The Secretary believes, with that, two types of commitments are needed. One is of global feeding and sustainability programs provided by USDA and the U.S. Agency for International Development. The other is getting behind increased agricultural research.
The reality is, in order for us to continue to be productive, in order for us to share the awareness of new technologies and new practices, and frankly to learn as well from developing countries, I think there are practices that are indigenous knowledge here in this country and elsewhere that could be helpful to us in terms of our own ability to maintain productivity. So to do that requires, I think, a commitment to research.
Then there is partnership in addressing both global and domestic food insecurity concerns, with Secretary Vilsack focused specifically on public-private partnerships.
It's important for there to be a collaborative effort between the government and the private sector. I think it's important for the government to continue to look for creative ways to encourage the private sector to be engaged.
In addition,
I think we also want to look for ways in which the government, as it's purchasing food, as it's supporting those families, also finds a way to support small and local and regional producers. In other words, in order to buy food for the food banks or for school meal programs, shouldn't we spend a significant amount of that resource buying from local producers so that you're stimulating the local economy, you're providing additional revenue sources for those small and mid-sized producers, keeping them on the farm and in business. It's important for rural America and for the rural economy to do that.
He adds education for various public and private entities on how they can address food insecurity concerns within their sphere of influence also contributes to improve food security. Using the example of a tribal college in Colorado.
They've established their own little food pantry, and there's opportunities at USDA for grants and resources to be able to support that kind of activity.
I'm Rod Bain reporting for the U.S. Department of Agriculture in Washington, D.C.
Once again, that was USDA's Rod Bain and Agriculture Secretary Tom Vilsack as he discussed ways that the U.S. and world could combat food insecurity. We're cutting to a short break now on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to Agriculture Today, and we conclude our Friday show with a weather update. And as always, we're joined with K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. Chip, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Last week you predicted we were going to have some rain, and we did.
Yeah, we did get much needed rainfall across portions of north central to southeast Kansas. The parts of southwest, south central, and northwest unfortunately did miss out. But where they saw rain, we had as much as 3+ inches of rain in north central Kansas. And that was heavy rain to start with some light rain afterwards. Everyone enjoys that nice light rain afterwards. We need that. But unfortunately, it was just a drop in the bucket for a lot of those places where, especially when we look at eastern Kansas, we're looking at 10, 15 inches below normal precipitation. So we need a lot of rainfall, and we need multiple rounds of it to help offset some of the big concerns that we've seen of like low stream flows, low reservoir levels, public water supply challenges. All it's just a sign of much longer drought despite, at least a little drop in the bucket last week.
And how did that rain play into the drought monitor?
Yes, the drought monitor still has over 20% of the state in extreme or worse drought, most of it in that south central area in the southern Flint Hills. But we did see improvements in some of those isolated areas that saw the heavier rains, like around Norton, some areas in north central and then eastern Kansas. But we also saw degradation as well in the Northwest, where they've gone quite a long time, some of them 40, 45, 50 days without a quarter inch of rain. So despite them starting summer really wet, they've dried out quite a bit, and now they're running into challenges with those dry topsoils too.
And have high temperatures been with that dry weather?
Seasonal the last few days, but we were warming back up, and now we're going to be much above normal for the next 4 to 5 days into middle of next week, with temperatures 15, even 20 degrees above normal. Our average temperatures are in the middle 70s for highs, and we'll be in the middle 90s for highs. So not a good combination when we look at the short-term drought that's redeveloped in places like the Northwest. But we're also going to combine that with wind. And so what happens in October when we get warm and windy is we typically see the fire threat go up pretty substantially, especially with some of these heavier fuel loads, heavier grass loading than we've seen in some places. So we're not out of the woods with the heat yet, and we're going to just add to the fire.
You mentioned middle of next week maybe kind of breaking that pattern?
Yes, the pattern's going to break down. We had this dominant high pressure. It's going to shift off to the east. It should allow some moisture to stream northward along a stationary front. Likely the middle of next week, hard to tell when, but we'll see fairly widespread precipitation, I think, for a lot of the state. Convective precipitation, though, so isolated heavy rains that are very inconsistent and spread. Some folks might get way too much rain, but it looks like most of the state has a pretty good chance at least a quarter to a half inch of rain, which is about average for central East Kansas this time of year. That's also going to bring in some cooler weather. And by cooler, we're getting in the ballpark for first fall freeze and frost, but we're not quite there yet. We'll still be seasonal, though. I think we'll be in the middle 70s for at least the next week after that. So 90 should take a break by middle of next week.
And beyond next week, what are you seeing?
Yeah, so it looks like we're going to gradually kind of warm back up, and we're going to stay average to slightly above average, and precipitation chances will likely dwindle into middle of October. As you look further out, a little bit more uncertainty, but the contributions of El Nino and then other contributions like the polar vortex and the Arctic Oscillation, as well as the warm Pacific waters right now, are going to play a role, I think, in some cold air outbursts as we get into early winter. We'll see some periods of below average temperatures, probably substantially cold in early winter, but overall prevailing dry. And so when we look at things like, the Farmer's Almanac gets brought up quite a bit this time of year, but they're calling for cold and average snowfall. And I think actually that's a pretty good thing to consider, because we're going to get some cold snaps in here early winter, and I think we're going to average out with warm periods in between, but with more cold air than what we saw last year. We got a lot of moisture to our south with that active El Nino jet stream. That leaves the potential for definitely more snowfall. And last year, Kansas, a lot of parts of Kansas had record low snowfall. So even if we got average this year, that's going to seem like a ton of snow compared to normal. So it's all in perspective, and you can take it with a grain of salt. And obviously things will come better full picture as we get closer to when these shorter term oscillations like the polar vortex and the North American oscillation, when those kind of things come together short term, we'll have a better prediction of what's going to happen.
That was K-State meteorologist Chip Redmond. That's all we have for you this week on Agriculture Today, but we'll be back with more for you on Monday.